tell you about my grandparents. On my father's side, I knew them reasonably well. I knew my grandfather, my grandmother, Maria and Domenico Donato, Di Donato, from when I was very young. As a young kid, I'd go to their apartment. My grandmother would make uh, Italian pasta on a great big dining room table, and I would help her, and everybody would help her because that was the thing that she would do. She wanted everybody involved with it. And so we'd make the Italian pasta, then let it dry up, and then we'd have a great big pot, a cannibal pot you'd call it today, with water and pasta in it. My father, my mother, my brother, my sister, my uncle, my aunt, my other uncle, my other aunt, my cousins, everybody would go. We'd have a great big Sunday afternoon. And usually it was with homemade pasta and chicken, because chicken was the big thing. And of course, vegetables galore, because my grandfather owned a vegetable stand. The one thing we used to do that I really loved, and at that time did, we would put olive oil in one dish and salt and pepper in another dish and celery sticks. And we dip one into the other. So as kids, we used to go crazy doing that. Of course, the parents would say, cut it out, slow down. My grandmother was a dynamo. She was about 4'6", 4'8", but she would always be moving, and she'd always be doing things. Always a very, very pleasant lady who got things done and moved them along very nicely. She helped my mother when my mother had a nervous breakdown, and she was just a nice person. She would go to Mass almost every day, and as she got older, it became more difficult, and when she was 65, she fell on the ice, broke her arm, so she had to stop going for a little while. But as soon as the ice melted, she started to go again. My grandfather, he was a quiet guy. When he was younger, he was very dynamic. The stories are about him that he was in the Tunisian War with Italy, fighting on the Italian side, or was in the, what do they call those things, in the holes in the ground.
Like a foxhole or a...
Foxhole.
Okay.
He was in the foxholes while they were fighting, and he did that for a year and a half. Went through very, very difficult food problems because they were in Africa. They were not in Italy, and they didn't have the food, the same kind of food, and the importing of the food became very hard. But nonetheless, he lasted that out, came home, got an honorable discharge, became a merchant marine, and went around the world as a merchant marine. He enjoyed ships and enjoyed working on them. That was the story about him. My grandmother was very protective of him because when he got back from going around the world, married her, there were a few ladies of the street who really wanted to take him over, but she was very, very protective lady, tough lady, kept the older girls away. My grandfather, as he aged, became much more quiet, but always very nice. Never spoke out coarsely, that I heard. He might have been tough with some other people, but he wasn't with me. I always found him to be a very nice guy. Loved his pipe. He had a pipe that had this long stem, and many of the stems he made himself, like in the old days, with a little bundle on the bottom that he would stick the stem into. He used to make his own wine, loved making wine, had a wine press in my uncle's house, and so he would go there and make the wine, and then he would barrel it and keep it for a certain number of months until he thought it was time to take it out and distribute. Also kept a little farm where he grew peaches and corn and beans, other beans, some squash, but and peppers, red peppers, like those. My grandfather, I got to know my grandfather, my grandmother, from the standpoint that they knew me, I knew them. We talk about little things here and there. My grandfather, on one of his trips, had come back with a little statuette which had 3 monkeys. One with hear no evil, see no evil, say no evil. I got a kick out of that. It was a very, very interesting piece. He kept that for, oh God, 50, 75 years. I mean, when he died, it was still there. I don't know what happened to it since then. On the other side of family, on my mother's side, I never knew my grandmother. I don't ever remember meeting her. I know that she was ill for the most part of her life, that my mother took care of the household to make sure that everything was going good. My mother was the second in age and was quite good in the kitchen, and as well as making sure that everybody did their jobs. Because with a lot of people in the house, everybody had to do their job. So they made their beds, and she made sure they made their beds. They picked up their wash and all that sort of business. But my grandmother, on my mother's side, I didn't know her at all. My grandfather, I got to meet at the wake of my grandmother. My grandmother died when she was 50. She had cancer. My grandfather was there, and his son Calvin, who was at that time 17, and I was 13, so we related to some degree, also because we looked very much alike. My uncle Calvin introduced me to my grandfather. My grandfather, over the next few years, I would see from time to time. He never became close. The most endearing thing he had was a dog named Rex, and dog, like the ship. And the dog was very good, could do all sorts of tricks, was a very pleasant one. But my grandfather did not endear himself to his whole family, and as a result didn't go further with grandchildren. That's all I know about them. The extended family that came over about the same time as my father did were cousins. They primarily went to New Jersey and lived in Little Falls, New Jersey. There were 7 of them in the family, and 7 of his cousins, and of course their mother and father. The father in that group opened up an inn. He called it the Colonial Inn. The Colonial Inn quickly made a name for itself, and over the 20s and the 30s housed, besides some speakeasy activities, various shows and artists that were well known at the time. For instance, bands like Guy Lombardo, Tommy Dorsey, and Jimmy Dorsey would go there and play, and on WQXR and WHN, back in those days, there would be a recording every Friday night. And so WHN became very well known, and so the old Colonial Inn burned down. So they built the new Colonial Inn. And the new Colonial Inn was a little bit bigger, a little more prestigious, and they, uh, they kept that going, and all the bands continued to come in. My father, who was a classical trumpet player, could play with all those bands, and so he did. So he sat in when, when these people were coming in, and he'd get called and he'd come along. Very interesting piece about the old Colonial Inn and the new Colonial Inn was it had a little chicken farm next to it. And my grandaunt ran the chicken farm. And so that chicken farm would produce the chickens that they would feed at the restaurant, which was interesting. So the grandaunt one day asked me to come out and take a look. What she did, and how, so I went around and I learned about chickens. I got a big kick out of that. While at that Colonial Inn, I had, one night I was staying over. I was a young kid, I was about 6 years old, right? And the chorus girls had the second floor of the place, and they were all very beautiful, as chorus girls usually are, and I was sleeping on the second floor. And in the middle of the night, I wake up and I go into the hallway, and there are the chorus girls coming back from the shows. And one of them came up to me and put her hand on my face and said, "Hello, kid, what's your name?" And I told her, and she said, "Oh, and who were you related to?" And I told her that. And she said, "Oh, wonderful." She told me I was cute, made me feel so wonderful. My father, in 1947, I believe that was the date, in 1947, decided that he wanted to become a citizen, but he wanted to represent himself as Donato because the name Di Donato was old world, was not new world. And he was in the music business, and he was well known, and they called him Tony D, so it was Tony Donato. So he wanted that change, and so in 1947 he had that done. He had to have some certifications made, affidavits derived. My older brother developed an affidavit, submitted it on his behalf. That's why the name changed from Di Donato to Donato.
Did you have any crazy relatives? Eccentric relatives? Spinster aunts?
I can't think of any. They were all pretty straight. They were some were a little more aggressive. Aunt Edith was a fun person. She was always out there having, no matter what the situation was, how serious it was, she made it into something that was fun. I had Aunt Josie, she was straight-laced. Aunt Christina, she was straight-laced. My Uncle Sam, of course, was. No, I didn't have any crazy family, but I had a lot of fun people, and that was very important. And one of the people I had was my cousin Pat, who was a Juilliard pianist, who did he played classical music, of course, because he went to Juilliard, but he then became an arranger and performer with some pretty big bands around the country. Spent time in Cleveland, which was very prestigious at the time, and then he went to Washington, where they did work at the Statler Hilton in Washington for quite a few years. He played for Margaret Truman. Margaret Truman was a singer, and of course, her father was the president. And she came in one day to Statler Hilton, and asked if she could sing, and he said sure. So he sat and he played for her. He could play anything that you asked him to play. He could play in any key that you asked him to play. If he heard the music once, he repeated it right on tempo and on time. He was really a superb musician. He died when he was 36. Basis for moving piano. And I started working on that. After that, my father moved me to another one of his network, a band pianist. Name was Basso. And so Mr. Basso taught me, or introduced me to Mozart, Beethoven, and Chopin. Meanwhile, taught me how to play music with a band. And so during that same period of time, my father had a band which was predominantly or working with different ethnic groups. So Spanish was a big one, so he brought me to the Spanish place. I met a Spanish pianist who taught me how to play Spanish music. So my father was a band person and was with band, so he decided that I should be introduced to band piano. And he brought me to a couple of his gigs, but one of them was in the New Yorker Hotel. That was straight American, so therefore what we did is the regular pianist played during the band operation, and in between, as a filler, I filled in with any music that I thought I could do and would do. And so I did that. By doing that, I learned that I really was not as much a band pianist as I was a cocktail pianist, where I could sit and play cocktail music. I always loved classical music, but you'd never make a buck with classical music unless you're so good that they can't avoid it. But so I played at the New Yorker Hotel, and I got such a kick out of that. Subsequently, I played some cocktail and whatever. But then I learned something about myself. I became engaged to Lois when I was a junior in college. And my mother had always told me, a musician's life is a gypsy life. If you're a musician, you really should never get married and have children, because you're never home, you're always on the road, which is what happened with my father. And so there I am at Lois's house, we are engaged, right? And I'm a junior in college, and I get a call from a band leader who's leaving for Cleveland the next day. He heard about me, he wants me to play in his band. A 6-month gig in Cleveland, at the Statler Hotel in Cleveland, and then a 6-month gig in Washington, at the Statler Hotel in Washington. I said, I'll have to call you back, I have to talk to my fiancée. So I called Lois, and I said, let me tell you what just happened. And she said, oh, that's so wonderful. I called Lois and told her about that. And she said to me, I hope you have a wonderful life with your band, because you're not going to have it with me.